A racist passenger demands that a black family move out of first class, but the captain's announcement leaves her speechless. The bustling terminal of JFK International Airport pulsed with its usual symphony of rolling luggage, hurried footsteps, and overlapping announcements echoing through the vast space. Among the sea of travelers, the Johnson family made their way toward the first-class check-in counter, their excitement barely contained despite the early morning hour. "Mom, look, they have a special line, just for us." Emily's voice carried across the marble floor as she pointed to the premium check-in area, her favorite book clutched tightly against her chest. At 9 years old, she had inherited her mother's attention to detail and her father's endless enthusiasm. Laura Johnson smiled at her daughter's observation while keeping a watchful eye on 7-year-old Ethan, who was practically bouncing with each step. "That's right, sweetheart. Remember what we talked about using our indoor voices?" She gently squeezed Emily's hand, her own heart fluttering with a mixture of excitement and anxiety about their first-class flight experience. David Johnson, wheeling their carefully packed luggage, couldn't help but beam with pride. After 15 years of dedicated work at his software company, this upgrade to first class was more than just a luxury. It was a testament to years of careful saving and planning. "You know what's even more special?" he whispered to Ethan, who looked up with wide-eyed curiosity. "They have seats that turn into beds." "Real beds?" Ethan gasped, his voice rising with amazement. "Like in our house?" "Indoor voice, champion," David reminded him with a wink. "But yes, almost like real beds. And wait until you see the special menu they have for kids." As they approached the check-in counter, Laura straightened her simple but elegant blazer, a recent purchase for their trip to visit her mother in California. She had spent hours preparing the children for this experience, teaching them about airplane etiquette and the importance of being respectful to fellow passengers and crew members. "Good morning." The check-in agent greeted them with genuine warmth. "Welcome to first-class check-in. I see we have the Johnson family traveling to Los Angeles today." Emily stepped forward, her manners impeccable. "Yes, ma'am. We're going to visit our grandmother. I brought my favorite book to read to her." She held up her worn copy of The Little Prince, its pages marked with countless colorful sticky notes. The agent's smile widened. "That's wonderful. I'm sure your grandmother will love that. Now, let me get your boarding passes ready." While they waited, Laura knelt down between her children. "Remember what we practiced? When we get on the plane, we use our indoor voices," Emily recited proudly. "And say please and thank you," Ethan added, bouncing slightly on his toes. "And we're respectful to everyone," they finished in unison, causing several nearby travelers to smile at their enthusiasm. David placed a gentle hand on Laura's shoulder, sensing her slight nervousness. "They'll be perfect," he whispered, "just like their mother." The check-in process completed smoothly, and the family made their way through security. Emily held her book close during the screening, while Ethan watched in fascination as their bags disappeared into the X-ray machine and emerged on the other side. As they walked toward their gate, the children's excitement continued to build. The terminal's massive windows offered views of planes taking off and landing, each one drawing gasps of wonder from Ethan. "Dad, will our plane be that big?" he asked, pressing his hands against the glass. "Even bigger," David replied, checking their gate number. "And we'll have the best view from up there." Laura used these moments to reinforce their preparation. "Remember, when we're boarding, we'll wait for our zone to be called. First class boards first, but we still need to be patient and orderly. Like when we line up at school." Emily nodded sagely, already familiar with the concept of taking turns. The family found seats near their gate, and Laura began their usual pre-flight routine. She pulled out sanitizing wipes for their hands and made sure each child had their own water bottle. David distributed their passports and boarding passes, turning it into a game of responsibility that both children took very seriously. Gate C4, flight number AA 2478. Emily read from her boarding pass, practicing the information just as her mother had taught her. The morning sun streamed through the terminal's windows, casting long shadows across the waiting area. Around them, other passengers began gathering. Business travelers in crisp suits, families with young children, elderly couples holding hands. The Johnsons sat together, a tight-knit unit in the midst of the airport's organized chaos. As the boarding time approached, Laura noticed both children becoming slightly fidgety with anticipation. She pulled out a small notebook and their favorite colored pens, a tried-and-true method of keeping them engaged during waiting periods. "Shall we make a list of everything we want to tell Grandma when we see her?" she suggested, and both children eagerly nodded. The pre-boarding announcement finally crackled over the speakers, and the Johnson family gathered their belongings. David held their boarding passes ready, while Laura ensured both children had their backpacks properly secured. "First-class passengers, we are now ready to begin boarding," the gate agent announced. Emily and Ethan exchanged excited glances, their previous practice sessions evident in how they calmly stood and lined up behind their parents. As they prepared to board, Laura felt a surge of pride in her children's behavior and gratitude for this special family experience they were about to share. Little did they know that their journey would become much more than just a first-class flight to visit Grandma. It would become a lesson in dignity, respect, and the power of grace under pressure. The sleek corridor of the jet bridge seemed to stretch endlessly before them as the Johnson family made their way toward the aircraft. Emily clutched her book tighter, while Ethan walked with measured steps, both children containing their excitement with admirable restraint. "Good morning. Welcome aboard." The flight attendant greeted them warmly at the aircraft door. Her name tag read Anna, and her smile reached her eyes as she noticed the children's barely concealed wonder. "First class is right this way." As they turned left into the first-class cabin, the contrast with their usual flying experience was immediate and striking. The cabin gleamed with subtle luxury, wide leather seats arranged in spacious pairs, each with its own miniature console of controls and a screen that seemed larger than their television at home. "Wow," Ethan whispered, remembering to keep his voice down. "It's like a spaceship." Laura consulted their boarding passes, guiding her family to their assigned seats. "3A and 3B for you and Dad, Emily and Ethan. We're right across in 3D and 3E." The children slid into their seats with careful movements, their eyes wide as they took in their surroundings. Emily's fingers traced the smooth leather armrest, while Ethan discovered the button that controlled the seat recline, quickly stopped by David's gentle hand. "Let's wait until we're in the air for that, buddy," David said softly, helping him with the seatbelt instead. 3 rows ahead, Helen Parker adjusted her Hermes scarf with practiced precision, her attention drawn to the new arrivals. A frequent first-class passenger on this route, she had developed certain expectations about her travel environment. The sound of children's voices, no matter how subdued, was not part of them. She watched through narrowed eyes as Laura helped Emily store her backpack under the seat. Helen noted Laura's simple gold jewelry and modest designer blazer, likely from last season's collection, she surmised with a slight curl of her lip. The family's excitement, though contained, was evident in their wide-eyed expressions and whispered conversations. It was, in Helen's opinion, disappointingly common. "Would you like a pre-departure beverage?" Anna approached the Johnson family with her professional smile. "We have champagne, orange juice, or water available." "May I have orange juice, please?" Emily asked politely, sitting up straight in her seat. "Orange juice for me too, please," Ethan added, remembering to use please just as they had practiced. Helen's fingers tightened around her champagne flute as she observed the interaction. In her view, first class was a sanctuary for experienced travelers who understood its unwritten rules, not a family outing to be treated like a trip to Disneyland. "The children are so well-behaved," commented the elderly gentleman seated across from Helen. She responded with a non-committal hum, taking another sip of her champagne. Laura and David settled into their seats across the aisle, exchanging warm glances as they watched their children explore the amenity kits left on their seats. "Look, Mom," Emily whispered excitedly. They gave us special socks. Anna returned with their drinks, each served in proper glassware despite being just orange juice. "Here you are," she said, placing them carefully on their tray tables. "And these are your menus for today's flight. We'll be serving lunch about an hour after takeoff." "Thank you very much," David responded, accepting the elegant leather-bound menus. Helen watched as the children carefully handled their glasses, using both hands just as they'd clearly been taught. Their sincere gratitude and careful movements only served to heighten her irritation. It felt like a performance, a rehearsed show of propriety that, to her, highlighted their inexperience with luxury travel. As more passengers boarded and passed through to the main cabin, the first-class section gradually filled. The Johnson family continued their quiet exploration of their surroundings, with Emily showing Ethan how to use the entertainment system and David explaining the seat controls in hushed tones. "Look at all the movies," Ethan whispered to his sister, scrolling through the selections with careful movements on the touchscreen. Helen shifted in her seat, her discomfort growing with each passing minute. She had paid a premium for this experience, as she did every month for her business trips, and the presence of the Johnson family felt like an intrusion into her carefully curated travel routine. The final pre-departure checks began, with Anna moving through the cabin ensuring everything was in order. She paused to help Emily store her book in the seat pocket and showed Ethan how to adjust his headphones properly. "You have such lovely children," Anna commented to Laura, genuine appreciation in her voice. "It's refreshing to see young passengers who understand airplane etiquette so well." Laura beamed with pride, while Helen barely suppressed an audible scoff. To her, it was just further evidence of the declining standards in first class. In her day, children simply didn't travel in premium cabins. It wasn't done. As the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their imminent departure, the Johnson family settled into a quiet anticipation. Emily pulled out her notebook to start documenting their journey, while Ethan watched the ground crew through his window with fascination. Helen took another long sip of her champagne, steeling herself for what she was certain would be a trying flight. In her mind, she was already composing the strongly worded email she would send to the airline's customer service department about maintaining the standards of their premium product. Little did she know that this flight would challenge not just her expectations of first-class travel, but her entire worldview in ways she could never have anticipated. The aircraft reached its cruising altitude, and the soft ding of the seatbelt sign turning off seemed to heighten Helen Parker's already fraying nerves. She watched with mounting displeasure as Emily Johnson carefully unfolded her tray table to continue writing in her journal, the child's methodical movements somehow making it worse. "Would anyone like a warm towel?" Anna's voice carried through the cabin as she began the premium service routine. Helen observed as each member of the Johnson family accepted their towels with genuine thanks, using them exactly as intended, another sign, in her mind, of their obvious preparation for this flight. It felt rehearsed, artificial, like they were trying too hard to belong in a world that wasn't naturally theirs. "How refreshing to see children with such lovely manners," whispered Mrs. Thompson, part of the elderly couple seated across from Helen. Her husband nodded in agreement, smiling warmly as Ethan carefully handed his used towel back to Anna with both hands. Helen's jaw clenched. "Refreshing?" she thought bitterly. "It's practically a circus performance." The businessman in 2C, whom Helen recognized from several previous flights as a tech executive, caught her eye and smiled. "Makes a change from some of the entitled adults we usually see up here, doesn't it?" he commented, clearly noting her rigid posture. Helen managed a tight smile in response, but internally, her irritation deepened. "Entitled?" She fumed silently. "We've earned our place here through years of hard work and success, not some lucky upgrade or saved-up points." As lunch service began, Helen's discomfort reached new heights. The flight attendants seemed to have taken a particular shine to the Johnson family, with Anna spending extra time explaining the menu options to the children. "For the appetizer, we have a lovely butternut squash soup," Anna explained patiently to Emily. "And yes, we can certainly bring your main course at the same time as your parents." "Thank you so much," Emily responded, her genuine politeness making Helen's fingers drum against her armrest. David Johnson caught his daughter's eye from across the aisle and gave her a subtle thumbs up, clearly proud of her comportment. The simple gesture made Helen's blood pressure rise further. This isn't a teaching moment, she thought. This is supposed to be a refined travel experience. The final straw came when Ethan, after finishing his kid's meal, which Helen noted with disdain was served on proper china, asked if he could share his dessert with his sister. The simple act of sharing, which drew admiring glances from other passengers, struck Helen as completely inappropriate for the first-class cabin. "Just darling," Mrs. Thompson commented to her husband. "Remember when our grandchildren were that age?" The businessman in 2C chimed in again. "I wish my kids had been that well-behaved when they were young. The Johnsons must be doing something right." Helen watched as Anna brought extra napkins for the children to share their dessert, the flight attendant's genuine affection for the family evident in her every movement. It was all too much. The mounting praise, the obvious preferential treatment, the disruption of what Helen considered proper first-class protocol. "This has to stop," Helen decided, straightening her Hermes scarf with determination. "Someone needs to maintain standards, and clearly, it falls to me to do so." She observed as Laura Johnson helped Ethan clean a small spot of chocolate from his chin, the mother's movements quick and discreet. Even this simple act of parenting seemed, to Helen, out of place in the premium cabin. First class isn't a family room, she thought bitterly. It's meant to be an exclusive experience. The businessman was now engaged in a quiet conversation with Emily about her book, seeming genuinely interested in her detailed explanation of The Little Prince. The Thompson couple continued to beam at the family like proud grandparents, and even the usually stoic business traveler in 1A had cracked a smile at Ethan's careful handling of his silverware. Helen's decision crystallized as she watched Anna return yet again to check on the Johnson family's comfort. "This ends now," she resolved, her fingers pressing the call button with perhaps more force than necessary. "I'll simply have a quiet word with Anna about maintaining appropriate standards in first class. Surely she'll understand. She's a professional, after all." As she waited for Anna to respond to her call, Helen rehearsed her planned speech in her head, convinced she was acting in the best interests of all proper first-class passengers. She failed to notice how her own behavior had begun to draw concerned glances from her fellow travelers, too focused on her self-appointed role as guardian of first-class propriety. The irony that she had become the most disruptive presence in the cabin was completely lost on her as she prepared to voice her complaints, setting in motion a confrontation that would challenge everything she thought she knew about class, dignity, and true refinement. Anna approached Helen's seat with her characteristic professional smile, though she noticed the tight-lipped expression on the passenger's face. "How may I help you, Miss Parker?" Helen glanced around before leaning forward, lowering her voice to what she considered a discreet level. "Anna, I need to speak with you about a rather delicate matter." She gestured subtly toward the Johnson family. "Surely there must be some mistake with the seating arrangements?" Anna's smile remained fixed, but her eyes showed a flicker of understanding. "I'm not quite sure what you mean, Miss Parker. Is there an issue with your seat?" "Not my seat," Helen pressed, her voice taking on an edge of condescension. "I'm concerned about the appropriateness of having children in first class. Surely they would be more comfortable in the main cabin? This is meant to be a premium experience, after all." The last few words carried slightly louder than intended, causing several heads to turn. Emily, who had been absorbed in her book, looked up briefly before returning to her reading, but Laura Johnson's shoulders tensed noticeably. Anna's professional demeanor never wavered, though her voice took on a firmer tone. "Miss Parker, I can assure you that all our passengers are seated according to their ticketed assignments. The Johnson family has valid first-class tickets, and they're being exemplary passengers." "But surely you must understand," Helen persisted, her voice rising slightly with frustration. "First class has certain standards. It's not a family playground. I paid a premium for a refined travel experience." The businessman in 2C, who had introduced himself earlier as Michael Chun, cleared his throat pointedly. "Excuse me," he interjected, "but I couldn't help overhearing. What exactly about this family's behavior do you find lacking in refinement?" Helen turned, startled by the intervention. "Well, that is to say, children simply don't belong in first class. It's a matter of maintaining proper standards." "Proper standards?" Mr. Thompson spoke up from his seat, his elderly voice carrying a note of steel. "My wife and I have been observing nothing but proper standards from that family. More than I can say for some complaints I'm hearing." The cabin had grown uncomfortably quiet, with only the ambient engine noise filling the space. Even Ethan had stopped playing his game, sensing the tension in the air. Helen felt her face flush, but pressed on, turning back to Anna. I simply think there should be age restrictions for premium cabins. It's about maintaining the exclusivity of the experience. Ms. Parker, Anna responded calmly. Our first-class service is exclusive based on ticket purchase, not age or any other factors. The Johnson family has every right to be here, and they've been nothing but courteous and respectful. I have to agree, added a woman in 1D who had been quiet until now. Those children are better behaved than many adults I've flown with. Helen's isolation grew as more passengers began to voice their support for the Johnson family. She noticed Laura Johnson sitting perfectly straight in her seat, dignity evident in every line of her posture, while David had placed a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Well, I never," Helen sputtered, her face now crimson. "In all my years of first-class travel, I've never seen such a decline in standards. When I first started flying premium cabins, there was an understanding about these things." Michael Chin leaned forward in his seat. "Perhaps it's time for some understandings to change, Ms. Parker. The only disruption to my premium experience today has been this unnecessary conversation." The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically. What Helen had intended as a private complaint had transformed into a public referendum on her own behavior. She could feel the disapproving glances from her fellow passengers, but her pride wouldn't allow her to back down. "I will be writing to the airline about this," she declared, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "This is simply unacceptable." "What's unacceptable," Mrs. Thompson said clearly, "is judging a family who has shown nothing but grace and proper manners since the moment they stepped aboard." Anna maintained her professional composure throughout the exchange, but her stance had shifted slightly, almost protectively, toward the Johnson family's seats. "Ms. Parker, I must ask that we end this conversation. If you have concerns about our seating policies, you're welcome to contact customer service after the flight. For now, I need to ensure all our passengers feel comfortable and respected." The emphasis on her last words was subtle but clear. Helen sat back in her seat, her face burning, but her expression remained defiant. She could feel the weight of disapproval from her fellow passengers, but in her mind, she was still standing up for proper standards, even if she stood alone. What she didn't realize was that this confrontation was far from over, and the next intervention would come from an even more authoritative source. The true lesson in class and dignity was about to unfold in a way she never expected. The tension in the first-class cabin hung thick in the air when the cockpit door opened with a subtle click. Captain John Harris emerged, his presence immediately commanding attention. His silver-streaked hair and crisp uniform carried an air of authority that made even Helen straighten in her seat. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the cabin. "I apologize for stepping away from the flight deck. We're in good hands with my co-pilot. However, I was informed of a situation that I felt required my personal attention." The captain stood at the front of the first-class cabin, his experienced eyes scanning the passengers before settling briefly on Helen, then moving to the Johnson family. His expression was professional, but carried an unmistakable warmth. "In my 30 years of flying with this airline, I've learned that what truly makes first class isn't the width of the seats or the quality of the champagne," he continued. "It's the standard of respect and dignity we maintain for every passenger who steps aboard our aircraft." Emily looked up from her book, her eyes wide with admiration for the captain's uniform. Ethan sat perfectly still, sensing the importance of the moment. Laura and David exchanged glances, their hands finding each other across the aisle. "I want to be very clear," Captain Harris said, his voice taking on an edge of steel beneath its professional tone. "This airline prides itself on providing a premium experience for all our first-class passengers, regardless of their age, background, or how frequently they fly with us. Every passenger who holds a first-class ticket has earned their right to be here." Helen's face began to flush as the captain's words hit their mark. She clutched her scarf, her knuckles white against the silk. Captain Harris turned specifically toward the Johnson family, his stern expression softening into a genuine smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, Emily, Ethan, on behalf of our entire crew, I want to personally welcome you to first class." Your impeccable manners and consideration for fellow passengers exemplify exactly what we hope to see in our premium cabin." Ethan beamed at the captain's recognition, while Emily sat up straighter, pride evident in her posture. David nodded gratefully, and Laura blinked back tears of appreciation. The other passengers began to murmur in agreement. Michael Chin from 2C gave the family a thumbs up, while the Thompson couple smiled warmly. Even the quiet businessman in 1A nodded approvingly. Furthermore, the captain continued, "I want to remind everyone that our crew members, including our excellent flight attendant Anna, have my full support in ensuring all passengers are treated with respect. Any concerns about our seating policies can be directed to our customer service team after the flight." Helen sank lower in her seat, the weight of the captain's words and the supportive looks being directed at the Johnson family, making her feel increasingly isolated. Her earlier righteousness had evaporated, replaced by a creeping sense of shame. "Now," Captain Harris said, his tone lightening, "I understand Emily has brought along The Little Prince. That happens to be one of my favorite books. Perhaps, if your parents agree, you might share your favorite part with us when I return after landing?" Emily's face lit up. "Really? I'd love to, Captain," she replied, looking to her parents for permission. They nodded, touched by the captain's kindness. "Then it's settled," he smiled. "For now, I should return to the flight deck. Anna and her team will ensure you have everything you need for a comfortable flight. All of you," he added, his gaze sweeping the cabin meaningfully. As Captain Harris turned to leave, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed. The other passengers were now openly engaging with the Johnson family, asking Emily about her book and complimenting Ethan on his excellent behavior. Helen sat rigid in her seat, her earlier complaints now echoing in her mind with painful clarity. She watched as Anna resumed her duties, efficiently attending to all passengers while maintaining her professional warmth. The flight attendant's ability to remain gracious, even after Helen's behavior, only added to her growing discomfort. The captain's intervention had done more than just resolve a conflict. It had exposed the true meaning of class and dignity. As Helen observed the natural interactions between the Johnsons and their fellow passengers, she began to realize that perhaps she had been the one who needed a lesson in proper first-class behavior. The remainder of the flight stretched before her, and for the first time in her many years of premium travel, Helen Parker felt distinctly out of place in first class, not because of her ticket, but because of her actions. As the flight progressed over the Midwest, Helen found herself unable to focus on her usual in-flight routine. Her laptop remained closed, her work emails unchecked, as she became an unwitting witness to the genuine warmth the Johnson family brought to the cabin. Through the reflection in her window, she watched Emily lean across the aisle to show her mother a drawing she'd made, a carefully detailed sketch of the airplane's first-class cabin, complete with stick figures of the passengers. The girl had even included Helen, she noticed with a twinge of discomfort, drawing her with her distinctive scarf. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Laura praised softly. "Why don't you show it to Mrs. Thompson? She mentioned she likes to draw too." Helen observed as Emily politely approached the elderly couple, her small steps careful and measured. Mrs. Thompson's face lit up at the child's artwork, and soon they were engaged in a quiet conversation about drawing techniques. Mr. Thompson pulled out his reading glasses to better appreciate the details, making Emily beam with pride. "When was the last time I made someone smile like that?" Helen wondered, the thought catching her by surprise. Across the aisle, Ethan was having his own moment of connection. The businessman in 2C, Michael Chun, had noticed the boy's interest in his tablet device and was now showing him a flight tracking app, explaining their route across the country. Ethan's questions were thoughtful and measured, his enthusiasm contained but genuine. "Look, Dad," he whispered excitedly. "We're flying over Chicago right now." David leaned over to share in his son's excitement, and Helen couldn't help but notice how he managed to engage with his child while maintaining perfect awareness of his surroundings, never once disturbing other passengers. The scene forced her to confront her earlier assumptions. These weren't children running wild in a premium cabin. They were young people being taught how to navigate the world with grace and consideration for others. A memory surfaced unbidden. Her own first flight in first class, years ago when she'd been so nervous about belonging that she'd barely touched her meal. A kind flight attendant had noticed her discomfort and had taken extra time to make her feel welcome. When did I forget what that felt like? She wondered. The lunch service had long since ended, but the sense of community in the cabin continued to grow. Laura shared some homemade cookies she'd packed for the flight, offering them first to Anna and then to nearby passengers. The simple gesture sparked quiet conversations throughout the cabin. "These are wonderful," Mrs. Thompson commented. "Is that a hint of cardamom?" "My grandmother's recipe," Laura explained warmly. "She always said food tastes better when shared." Helen watched as the cookie bag made its way around the cabin, deliberately skipping her seat. Not out of malice, she realized, but out of respect for the distance she herself had created. The realization sat heavy in her stomach. As the afternoon wore on, she observed more small acts of kindness. Emily helping an elderly passenger adjust her reading light, Ethan carefully collecting trash from nearby seats to save Anna an extra trip, David offering his newspaper to another passenger who'd finished his book. The weight of her earlier behavior pressed down on Helen with each passing moment. She thought about her carefully curated image of first-class travel, the exclusivity, the privilege, the separation from others, and began to see how hollow it all seemed compared to the genuine connections being formed around her. A particularly poignant moment came when Emily began reading quietly from The Little Prince to her brother. Helen caught fragments of the famous quote, "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye." The words struck her with unexpected force. Here she had been, judging this family based on her visible assumptions about class and belonging, while being blind to the invisible qualities that truly mattered: kindness, respect, and genuine consideration for others. The businessman who had defended the family was now dozing peacefully, a small smile on his face. The Thompson couple had settled into a comfortable conversation with Laura about their own grandchildren. The cabin had transformed into exactly what first class should be, a space of comfort and dignity for all its occupants. Helen's own isolation felt increasingly self-imposed. She realized that she had been so focused on maintaining what she thought were proper standards that she had forgotten the most basic standard of all: human decency. As the sun began to set outside her window, casting a golden glow across the cabin, Helen found herself at a crossroads. The shame of her earlier behavior was evolving into something else, a recognition that perhaps it wasn't too late to learn from this experience, to make amends. She watched as Emily carefully tucked her brother's blanket around his sleeping form, as Laura exchanged warm smiles with Anna during the drink service, as David helped a fellow passenger retrieve something from the overhead bin. Each small act of kindness felt like a gentle rebuke to her earlier prejudice. What must it be like, she wondered, to move through the world with such natural grace? To belong not because of status or privilege, but because of how you treat others? The questions lingered in her mind as the flight continued westward, leading her toward a decision that would require more courage than she had needed in a long time. The captain's announcement that they were beginning their initial descent into Los Angeles stirred Helen from her deep contemplation. She glanced at her watch. Less than 40 minutes remained of the flight, and with it, her chance to make things right. The weight of her earlier behavior sat heavy in her chest, making her Hermes scarf feel more like a noose than an accessory. Now or never, she thought, gathering her courage. With careful movements, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, smoothing her skirt more out of nervous habit than necessity. The short walk to the Johnson family's seats felt like the longest journey of her life. Laura noticed her approach first, her posture tensing slightly, but her expression remaining neutral. David looked up from his magazine, instinctively shifting closer to Ethan's seat. The protective gesture wasn't lost on Helen, making her even more aware of how her actions had affected this family. "Mrs. Johnson," Helen began, her voice softer than it had been all day. "Mr. Johnson, I wonder if I might have a moment of your time?" The couple exchanged glances before Laura nodded, her face showing cautious curiosity. Emily looked up from her book, while Ethan paused his game, both children watching with innocent interest. Helen took a deep breath, her carefully prepared speech suddenly feeling inadequate. I owe you and your family an apology, she said, her voice catching slightly. My behavior earlier was inexcusable. I made assumptions and judgments that were not only wrong but cruel. The words began to flow more naturally as she continued. I've spent this flight watching your family, not with judgment this time, but with growing awareness of my own prejudices. The grace and kindness you've shown to everyone around you, including me after my terrible behavior, has taught me more about class than all my years of first-class travel. Laura's expression softened, while David sat up straighter, his protective stance relaxing slightly. Emily and Ethan exchanged glances, clearly not fully understanding the adult conversation, but sensing its importance. I was wrong, Helen continued, her voice stronger now. Wrong about what belongs in first class, wrong about your family, and most importantly, wrong about what true refinement looks like. You've demonstrated it in every interaction, she paused, swallowing hard, while I demonstrated exactly what doesn't belong here. David was the first to respond, his voice gentle. Thank you, Ms. Parker. It takes courage to acknowledge our mistakes. Please call me Helen, she replied, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. And thank you for your kindness, even now. Laura reached out and touched Helen's hand lightly. We all have moments when our prejudices get the better of us. What matters is recognizing them and choosing to do better. Emily, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, spoke up. Would you like to see my drawing, Ms. Helen? I drew everyone in the cabin, including you. Helen turned to the little girl, touched by her immediate offer of friendship. I would love to see it, Emily. I noticed you working on it earlier. You're quite the artist. Ethan, not wanting to be left out, added enthusiastically, but still mindfully of his volume. And I can show you the flight tracking app, mister. Chin showed me. We're almost to LA now. The tension that had surrounded Helen all flight began to dissolve as she found herself drawn into conversation with the children. She noticed other passengers watching the exchange, their expressions ranging from approval to outright warmth. Mrs. Thompson's voice carried from her seat. Now that's what I call real class, causing several passengers to nod in agreement. Anna, who had been discreetly observing the exchange, approached with a fresh round of drinks. Would anyone like a pre-landing beverage? She offered, including Helen in her warm smile for the first time since the earlier confrontation. As Helen accepted a glass of water, she felt the last of her artificial barriers crumbling. The first-class cabin no longer felt like a territory to be defended, but rather a space where genuine connections could flourish. You know, Laura said thoughtfully, my mother always says that the true measure of a person isn't in never making mistakes, but in how they handle them when they do. Helen nodded, feeling the truth of those words. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. I hope she knows what an extraordinary family she has. The announcement for final descent chimed overhead, but the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed. What had started as a space divided by prejudice had become one united by understanding and forgiveness. As Helen returned to her seat to prepare for landing, she caught her reflection in the window. The same designer clothes, the same carefully styled hair, the same Hermes scarf. But the person wearing them had changed. The Johnson family had taught her that true class had nothing to do with what you wear or where you sit, and everything to do with how you treat others. The Los Angeles skyline appeared on the horizon, marking not just the end of a flight, but the beginning of Helen's own journey toward a better understanding of what really matters in life. The gentle thud of landing gear touching down at LAX marked the end of a journey that had changed far more than just physical location. As the aircraft taxied to its gate, Helen observed the Johnson family's excitement building. Their earlier poise now sweetly tempered with barely contained anticipation. Do you think Grandma got our message about being early? Ethan whispered to his sister, bouncing slightly in his seat. Mom said she'd be waiting at arrivals, Emily replied, carefully packing her beloved book into her backpack. I can't wait to show her my drawing of the flight. As the seatbelt sign dinged off for the final time, Helen watched the family's methodical preparation for deplaning. Laura helped the children gather their belongings while David retrieved their carry-on bags from the overhead compartment. Even in their excitement, they maintained the consideration for others that had characterized their entire flight. The first-class cabin began to empty, but Helen deliberately took her time, finding herself unwilling to let go of this moment of transformation. She watched as the Johnson family made their way toward the exit, each child thanking Anna personally for her service. "Have a wonderful time with your grandmother," Anna called after them, her smile genuine and warm. Following at a distance, Helen emerged into the terminal behind the family. Through the crowd, she spotted an elderly woman whose face lit up at the sight of her approaching grandchildren. The woman's simple dress and practical shoes might once have drawn Helen's judgment, but now she saw only the beauty of the pure joy radiating from this family reunion. "Grandma," Emily and Ethan called out in unison, running forward but still mindfully avoiding other travelers, their earlier lessons and consideration clearly deeply ingrained. Helen paused, watching as the grandmother embraced each family member in turn. Laura's eyes glistened with tears as she hugged her mother, and David's warm handshake turned into an affectionate embrace. The scene stirred something deep within Helen's heart. When was the last time she had experienced such uninhibited joy at seeing her own family? How many connections had she missed while maintaining her carefully constructed walls of social status and presumed propriety? As she stood there, her designer luggage at her feet, Helen remembered her own grandmother. Not the formal holiday dinners or the inherited silver service, but the warm kitchen conversations and genuine laughter they had shared before Helen had become so focused on climbing the social ladder. The Johnson family's grandmother was now admiring Emily's flight drawing, her delight evident in her animated gestures. Helen could hear Ethan excitedly explaining about the flight tracking app, his grandmother giving him her complete attention despite the busy terminal surroundings. "You know," a voice beside her said, making her start slightly. It was Michael Chun, the businessman from 2C. "I used to be like you, so focused on maintaining an image that I forgot what really matters. It took my own kids to teach me otherwise." Helen nodded, understanding flowing between them. "They're remarkable," she said softly, watching the Johnson family's continued reunion. "The whole family. They've taught me more in one flight than I've learned in years of first-class travel." "The best lessons often come from unexpected teachers," Michael smiled before heading off toward the baggage claim. As Helen finally turned to make her way toward the exit, she caught one last glimpse of the Johnson family. They were walking together toward the baggage claim, the children holding their grandmother's hands, Laura and David following with their arms around each other. The sight filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Her phone buzzed with notifications, emails from clients, messages from her social circle, reminders of the carefully curated world she had built for herself. But somehow, they seemed less important now. Instead, her mind wandered to her own family, to connections she had let fade in pursuit of what she had thought was sophistication. Stepping out into the Los Angeles sunshine, Helen unwound her Hermes scarf, letting the warm breeze touch her neck. The simple sensation reminded her of childhood days when status symbols meant nothing, and joy came from genuine connections rather than artificial barriers. She pulled out her phone again, this time scrolling to a number she hadn't called in months. "Hi, Mom," she said when the call connected, her voice soft with emotion. "I just had the most extraordinary flight, and it made me think, would you like to have dinner this weekend? Just the two of us?" As she walked toward the taxi stand, Helen realized that the Johnson family had given her something far more valuable than a lesson in humility. They had reminded her of what truly makes life rich. Not the cabin you sit in or the clothes you wear, but the connections you nurture and the kindness you show to others. The Los Angeles traffic stretched before her, but Helen Parker was no longer the same person who had boarded that flight in New York. She had learned that true class isn't about excluding others. It's about making room for everyone at the table, first class or not. And somewhere in the same airport, a family was heading home with their grandmother, unaware that their simple presence had transformed not just a flight, but a life. Their legacy of kindness, respect, and genuine warmth would continue to ripple outward, touching lives in ways they might never know, starting with one changed heart in first class.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.